At dawn in Nairobi, the city looks like a promise. Glass towers catching the first light, traffic already humming, money moving invisibly through phones and banks. But rewind the film far enough and you hit a different Kenya. One where a black man could build a fortune and still be told, with a straight face, that he did not belong in the European parts of his own capital. One where a single signature from a colonial officer could erase your business overnight. One where the price of speaking too loudly was a cell, a beating, or a grave. No one was allowed to mourn in public. Now imagine a young man standing in that Kenya with nothing but a sharp mind, a stubborn spine, and a clock ticking in his head. Not a metaphorical clock, an actual deadline. Because in the 1950s, if you were a Kikuyu man suspected of sympathizing with the Mau Mau, you didn't get the luxury of someday. You had to make your move before the next raid, the next informer, the next curfew, the next list of names. You had to decide who you were going to be while the system was deciding what to do with you. That young man was Njenga Karume. He would become a name spoken in boardrooms and political rallies. A man who could sit with presidents and still talk like someone who remembered hunger. He would be called a businessman, a politician, a power broker, a philanthropist, a survivor. But before the titles, before the wealth, before the suits and the motorcades, there was a boy from Kiambu watching the world divide itself into those who could command and those who were expected to obey. And the first act of his life begins not with applause, but with pressure, tight, constant, and personal, like a hand around the throat of an entire generation. He was born in 1929 in Kiambu County, in the central highlands of Kenya. The land there is green and generous when the rains come, but colonial rule had turned land into a weapon. The best soil was fenced off, labeled, and guarded. The people who had lived on it for generations were pushed into crowded reserves, forced into wage labor, taxed into dependence. A child could learn politics simply by watching adults argue over a boundary line, a grazing path, a permit, a debt. Karume grew up in a society where the rules were written in a language of power. The colonial economy demanded African labor, but feared African independence. It wanted obedience, not ambition. It wanted workers, not owners. And yet, even in that controlled world, there were cracks, small openings where a determined person could squeeze through. He went to school, but like many of his era, education was not a straight road. It was interrupted by necessity, by the need to work, by the reality that colonial schooling was designed to produce clerks and subordinates, not leaders. What he gained early was not a certificate that opened doors, but a kind of street-level intelligence. How to read people, how to negotiate, how to spot an opportunity before someone else claimed it. In the 1940s and early 1950s, Nairobi was a magnet. It pulled young men from the countryside with the promise of wages and the thrill of a city that never fully slept. But Nairobi was also segregated in practice and in spirit. There were neighborhoods where Africans were tolerated only as labor. There were businesses where Africans could spend money but not sit down. There were clubs where the music played, but the doors stayed shut. Karume arrived in that city as one of thousands, another young African man trying to turn sweat into a future. He worked, he watched, he learned, and he began to understand something that would shape his entire life. In a system designed to keep you small, survival itself becomes a form of strategy. He started in modest trade, the kind of business that doesn't make headlines but teaches you everything. How to manage stock, how to deal with customers, how to keep accounts, how to handle the daily humiliation of permits and inspections and officials who could ruin you with a shrug. In colonial Kenya, an African entrepreneur had to be twice as careful and twice as tough, because the margin for error was not financial, it was political. Then the country caught fire. The Mau Mau uprising erupted in the early 1950s, rooted in land dispossession, political exclusion, and the brutal reality of colonial rule. The British declared a state of emergency in 1952, and Kenya changed overnight. Curfews, roadblocks, mass arrests, detention camps, villagization, torture, informers, collective punishment. The air itself felt watched. For Kikuyu communities, the emergency was not an abstract event. It was a daily threat. Men disappeared, families were broken, entire areas were treated as suspect. In Nairobi, the security apparatus tightened like a net. If you were Kikuyu, you could be stopped, searched, questioned, detained, sometimes for nothing more than your name and your face. This is where the clock in Karume's life starts ticking louder, because the emergency did something else. It forced choices. It demanded that people declare themselves, even when silence might have been safer. It created a brutal conflict, not only between colonizer and colonized, but within communities, between those who resisted and those who collaborated, between those who spoke and those who stayed quiet, between those who believed independence was worth any price, and those who feared the price would be paid by their children. Karume was not a man who could pretend politics was someone else's problem. He was living inside it, his community was living inside it, and the colonial state had made it clear. Neutrality would not protect you. He became involved in the nationalist movement that was gathering force beneath the surface. The names that would later become history, Jomo Kenyatta, Tom Mboya, Oginga Odinga, and others, were part of a rising tide, but in the 1950s that tide was met with batons and prison bars. Organizations were banned, meetings were broken up, leaders were arrested. The colonial government tried to cut the head off the movement, believing the body would collapse. Instead, the movement adapted. It went underground, it shifted tactics, it used networks of trust and secrecy. And in that world, a man with organizational skill and nerve could become invaluable. Karume's life in those years was shaped by a real, relentless opponent. The colonial security system. Not a single villain with a face, but a machine. Police, administrators, informers, laws, detention camps, built to crush dissent and control African economic life. It was a system that could take your freedom and your livelihood in the same week. And it wasn't only the state. There was also the pressure of poverty, the pressure of responsibility, the pressure of being a young man expected to provide in a time when providing could get you noticed. Every step forward risked drawing attention. Every connection risked being interpreted as conspiracy. Yet he kept moving. He built relationships in Nairobi's African business circles. People who understood that money and politics were not separate. Under colonial rule, economic independence was political. Owning a business was political. Hiring people was political. Refusing to be small was political. The emergency years were violent, but they were also years of intense organization. Nationalists needed funds, safe channels, trusted messengers. They needed people who could operate in the city without collapsing under fear. Karume's name became associated with that world of practical support, of keeping things moving when the official world tried to freeze African ambition. And then came the moment that would define the stakes. Karume was arrested and detained during the emergency period. Detention in colonial Kenya was not a simple prison sentence with clear rules. It was a tool of control, often indefinite, often brutal, designed to break the spirit and isolate the detainee from the community. Men were held for years without trial. Some were beaten, some were forced into hard labor, some were pressured to confess, to name names, to sign loyalty oaths. The goal was not justice, it was submission. For a businessman and organizer, detention was more than loss of freedom. It was the threat of erasure. Your business could collapse, your contacts could scatter, your family could suffer, your name could be poisoned. And the system counted on that fear. Inside detention, time becomes a weapon. Days blur, hope becomes dangerous. The mind starts bargaining. Say what they want, sign what they want, just go home. The colonial state understood that if it could control time, it could control men. Karume did not disappear from history in those years, but he was forced into a crucible that many did not survive intact. The details of every day are not neatly recorded, but the fact of detention itself tells you the level of risk he carried. He was not playing at politics, he was paying for it. And when he came out, Kenya was changing again. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the colonial government, exhausted by conflict, pressured by international opinion, and facing an unstoppable demand for self-rule, began to negotiate a transition. Political parties emerged in new forms. African leaders were released. Constitutional talks took place. The future, once whispered, was now argued openly. But the transition was not clean. It was tense, contested, and full of traps. The colonial state wanted to manage independence in a way that protected its interests. Different Kenyan communities debated what the new nation should look like. Rivalries formed, alliances shifted. The dream of freedom was real, but so was the danger that freedom could be captured by a few and sold back to the many. For Karume, this was not a time to relax. It was a time to position himself, carefully, decisively, because the skills that kept you alive under colonial rule were not the same. Skills that would keep you relevant in a new Kenya. The battlefield was changing from forests and detention camps to conference halls, party offices, and economic policy. He stepped deeper into public life, aligning with the nationalist leadership that would soon take power. He was part of the generation that moved from resistance to governance, from being hunted to being needed. And that shift is never simple. The habits of secrecy clash with the demands of public accountability. The friendships forged under pressure are tested by ambition. The moral clarity of us versus them becomes blurred when us now has authority. Yet Karume's trajectory was clear. He was becoming a figure who could operate in both worlds, the world of politics and the world of business. In a country about to be reborn, that combination was explosive, because independence was not only about flags and anthems, it was about who would control land, licenses, contracts, and capital. It was about who would inherit the economic machinery the colonial state had built. It was about whether Africans would become owners in their own country, or simply replace white faces with black faces while the structure stayed the same. Karume understood, perhaps earlier than many, that the next struggle would be fought with paperwork as much as with speeches, with titles and deeds, with company registrations, with access to credit, with the ability to navigate a bureaucracy that still carried colonial DNA. And he also understood something darker, that the new Kenya would not automatically reward sacrifice. Many who had suffered would be forgotten. Many who had collaborated would reinvent themselves. The line between hero and opportunist could be redrawn by whoever controlled the narrative. So he moved with urgency. In the early 1960s, as independence approached, political organizing intensified. The air was electric, hope mixed with suspicion. Meetings were crowded, promises were loud, and beneath it all was a quiet fear. What if the dream collapses at the last moment? What if the British delay? What if violence erupts? What if the new leaders turn on each other? For someone like Karume, who had already tasted detention, the fear was not theoretical. He knew how quickly the ground could shift. He knew that a man could be celebrated 1 month and arrested the next. He knew that the system, any system, could decide you were inconvenient. And then, in 1963, Kenya became independent. The Union Jack came down, the new flag rose, the anthem played. The crowd surged with joy. For many, it felt like the end of a nightmare. But for Karume, independence was not an ending. It was the opening of a new, more complicated act, one where the enemy would no longer be a foreign governor in a distant office, but the brutal realities of building a nation: corruption, inequality, political rivalry, and the constant temptation to turn power into personal property. Still, in that first rush of freedom, there was a moment when the impossible seemed possible. A man born under colonial rule could now imagine shaping the rules. A man once detained could now walk into rooms where decisions were made. A man from Kiambu could now think not only about survival, but about influence. And influence, in a young nation, is a dangerous kind of currency. Karume entered the independence era carrying 3 things that would define him: the memory of what the colonial state could do to a man, the practical instincts of a businessman who had learned to operate under pressure, and the political connections forged in the hardest years. Those 3 forces, fear, skill, and network, were about to collide with the opportunities and temptations of a new Kenya. The clock that had once been about avoiding arrest became a different clock. The race to secure a place in the new order before it hardened, before doors closed, before the winners wrote the rules in permanent ink. And as the celebrations faded and the real work began, Njenga Karume was already moving, because he knew something most people learn too late. Freedom is not the finish line, it is the starting gun. Independence was supposed to feel like a sunrise that never ends. Flags, songs, speeches, Kenya stepping into history with its head high. But in the weeks after the celebrations, another sound began to rise under the music. The dry scratch of pens on paper, land titles, trading licenses, import permits, bank guarantees, cabinet memos. The new nation was being built in ink, and ink could be as ruthless as bullets. Njenga Karume understood that faster than most, because he had already lived through a world where a single document could destroy you, where a colonial officer's signature could close your shop, cancel your permit, or send you into detention without trial. Now the signatures would be Kenyan. The question was terrifyingly simple. Would the new system finally open the gates, or would it just change the guards? Karume stepped into the independence era with a reputation that carried both promise and danger. He was known as a man who could organize, who could move resources, who could keep his nerve when the air smelled like fear. But the same qualities that made him valuable in the struggle could make him a target in peace. In a young country, power doesn't just attract allies, it attracts people who want to control you, silence you, or use you. And there was a deadline hanging over him, not written on any calendar, but felt in every decision. The first years after independence were the only window when the rules were still soft, when institutions were still forming, when relationships mattered more than procedures, when a man could rise quickly if he moved before the doors hardened shut. Karume moved. The political landscape after 1963 was a living storm. The Kenya African National Union, KANU, stood at the center of government, with Jomo Kenyatta as the towering symbol of the new state. But beneath the surface, the unity was fragile. The country was trying to stitch together communities with different histories, different fears, different expectations of what independence meant. Some wanted a strong central government. Others feared domination and demanded regional autonomy. Old rivalries didn't vanish with the Union Jack, they simply changed their language. And then there was the most explosive issue of all: land. Land was not just soil, it was memory, it was identity. It was the wound colonialism had cut deepest. The best land had been taken, fenced and farmed for profit, while Africans were pushed into crowded reserves. Independence raised a question that could ignite the country. Who would get the land back, and how? The government launched settlement schemes to buy former settler farms and resettle Africans. On paper, it was a path to justice. In reality, it became a battlefield of influence, access, and money. The people with connections could get information early. They could secure loans. They could navigate the bureaucracy. They could position themselves not just as beneficiaries, but as brokers. Karume was becoming exactly that kind of figure, a man who could operate where politics and business overlapped, where decisions were made in offices but felt in villages. He didn't come into this world as a polished technocrat. He came in as a survivor of the emergency, a businessman who had learned to read systems the way other people read weather. He knew when a storm was coming. He knew when to move stock, when to keep quiet, when to speak, when to wait. And now the storm was opportunity, dangerous, fast-moving, and full of people who would drown if they misjudged it. In Nairobi, the city was changing shape. African faces were appearing in spaces that had once been reserved for Europeans. But the old economic structure didn't collapse just because the flag changed. Capital was still concentrated. Credit was still hard to access for ordinary Africans. The bureaucracy still carried colonial habits: forms, stamps, delays, gatekeepers. The difference was that now the gatekeepers were Kenyan, and that made the struggle more intimate. You couldn't blame a distant empire anymore. If you were locked out, it was your own people holding the key. Karume's response was not to complain. It was to build. He expanded his business interests aggressively in the independence era, pushing into sectors that mattered in a growing capital: real estate, hospitality, transport, and trade. Nairobi was swelling with migrants looking for work, with civil servants moving into new offices, with foreign visitors arriving to see the new Africa. Hotels, bars, rental properties, these weren't just businesses, they were nodes of influence, places where deals were whispered, where alliances were tested, where information moved faster than newspapers. And information, in a young government, was power. But the more Karume's influence grew, the more he had to navigate a new kind of enemy, one that didn't wear colonial uniforms. It wore suits. It spoke the language of unity while fighting for advantage. It smiled in public and sharpened knives in private. Because independence did not erase competition, it intensified it. Within KANU and the broader political class, there were rival centers of power. There were ideological tensions between those who spoke of socialism and those who believed in private enterprise, between those who wanted rapid Africanization of the economy and those who feared chaos. There were ethnic anxieties, often unspoken but always present, shaping who trusted whom, who was invited into which room, who was considered safe. Karume's background placed him in the orbit of the Central Highlands political networks, close to the heart of Kenyatta's power base. That proximity could lift you like a strong wind. It could also throw you off a cliff if the wind changed. And the wind did change. The late 1960s were not a gentle settling into democracy. They were years of tension and consolidation. The state was trying to assert authority. Opposition voices were being squeezed. Political competition was becoming more dangerous, not less. The dream of a pluralistic, open political arena began to narrow as the ruling party tightened its grip. For a man like Karume, ambitious, connected, and increasingly wealthy, the question became, How do you grow without becoming a threat to the very people who can destroy you? He chose a path that many power brokers choose in young states. Become useful, become indispensable, not just a businessman chasing profit, but a political actor who could mobilize support, fund activities, stabilize networks, and deliver results. That usefulness pulled him deeper into formal politics. Karume's entry into parliamentary politics came in a Kenya where elections were not just contests of ideas. They were contests of survival. Constituencies were not abstract districts. They were communities with expectations, loyalties, and grievances. A member of parliament was not merely a legislator. He was a gate to development funds, jobs, and access to the state. People didn't just vote for speeches. They voted for roads, schools, clinics, water projects, anything that made independence feel real. Karume's political base was in Kiambu, a region that carried enormous weight in the post-independence order. But weight brings pressure. In such a region, you were not only competing against other candidates, you were competing against the expectations of a population that believed it had paid heavily for independence and deserved a return. And there was another pressure, quieter but constant. The fear of being outpaced by the new elite, because independence created a race to acquire property, a race to secure contracts, a race to build networks inside ministries and parastatals, a race to become somebody before the system solidified and the ladder was pulled up. Karume was running that race with the memory of detention still in his bones. He knew what it meant to have everything taken. He knew that security was not a feeling. It was assets, relationships, and leverage. And he knew that in politics, leverage could evaporate overnight. So he built redundancy. Multiple businesses, multiple alliances, multiple channels of influence. If one door closed, another had to open. But Kenya's politics in the 1970s and early 1980s would test that strategy brutally. After Kenyatta's death in 1978, the country entered a new era under Daniel Arap Moi. The transition was officially smooth, but beneath the surface it was a reordering of power. New loyalties were demanded. Old networks were scrutinized. People who had been close to the previous center of gravity had to prove they were not a threat to the new one. This was the moment when many careers broke. For Karume, the challenge was stark. He had built his influence in a Kenya shaped by Kenyatta's inner circles and the Central Highlands' political dominance. Now the presidency had shifted, and with it the balance of fear and favor. In such transitions, wealth can protect you, but it can also paint a target on your back. A rich man with political connections can be seen as a rival, a financier of dissent, a symbol of the old order. The system had changed faces, but it still had teeth. Moi's era became known for tight control of political space. The state security apparatus remained powerful. Dissent could be punished. Careers could be ended through administrative decisions, investigations, or political isolation. The message to politicians and businessmen was clear: align or be squeezed. Karume's real conflict in this period was not a single opponent, but the machinery of power itself. How it could shift, how it could demand loyalty, how it could punish independence of thought. He had fought a colonial system that tried to control African ambition. Now he had to navigate a post-colonial system that could control ambition just as effectively, using different tools. And he had a time limit again, another ticking clock. Not the emergencies, curfews, and raids, but the political clock of a regime consolidating itself. In the early years of a new presidency, the window for proving loyalty is short. Miss it, and you can be labeled permanently. In that environment, hesitation is dangerous. Karume adapted. He maintained relevance by staying close to the practical needs of politics, development, mobilization, and the ability to deliver. He cultivated a reputation as a man who could get things done, who could support community projects, who could help build institutions. In Kenya, where the state's resources were often distributed through political channels, being a development-minded leader was not just virtue, it was survival. At the same time, he continued expanding his business footprint, especially in Nairobi. Real estate in a growing capital is a form of long-term power. Buildings don't vote, but they outlast administrations. Land and property are patient. They wait while politicians rise and fall. Yet even property can become a battlefield when politics turns hostile. In the 1980s, Kenya's political climate tightened further, especially after the attempted coup in 1982. The state became more suspicious. The line between loyalty and disloyalty grew thinner. People watched their words. Meetings were monitored. The atmosphere carried a familiar taste, like the emergency, but with Kenyan accents. For someone like Karume, who had lived through colonial detention, that taste was not abstract. It was a warning. He had to keep his political profile strong enough to remain relevant, but not so strong that it looked like a challenge. He had to be visible, but not provocative. He had to be influential, but not threatening. That is a narrow bridge to cross, and many fall off. And then came a twist that would reshape Kenya's political future, and Karume's place within it. By the early 1990s, pressure for political reform was rising. Economic hardship, international pressure, and internal activism pushed Kenya toward multi-party politics. The one-party era began to crack. The streets filled with demands. The air thickened with possibility and danger. For politicians who had built careers within the ruling party structure, multi-party politics was both an opportunity and a threat. It could open space for new alliances. It could also expose old networks to public anger. People began to speak more openly about corruption, inequality, and the betrayal of independence's promises. Karume, with his wealth and long-standing political connections, could easily have been cast as a symbol of the old order. But he was also a man with deep roots in community politics and a reputation for practical support. He had to navigate a public mood that was changing fast, where the same crowd could cheer you for building a school and curse you for being part of a system they now distrusted. This was not a simple era of reform. It was a volatile era of shifting loyalties. Karume remained within the political mainstream, operating in a Kenya where the ruling party still held enormous power, but could no longer pretend the country was silent. Elections became more contested. Political rhetoric sharpened. Ethnic mobilization intensified in some areas, turning politics into a dangerous game of identity. And through it all, Karume's strategy remained consistent. Stay positioned at the intersection of money, community influence, and political access. But the most dramatic political turning point of his later career was still ahead, because Kenya was moving toward a moment when the old order would face its greatest test. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the question of succession, who would lead after Moi, became the central drama. The ruling party was fracturing. Opposition forces were learning to cooperate. The public was exhausted by economic strain and political control. The country felt like it was holding its breath. In that atmosphere, every major political figure had to choose: cling to the old structure or gamble on a new coalition. Karume's choice would place him in the middle of one of the most consequential political shifts in Kenya's post-independence history. As the 2002 election approached, the opposition began to unify into a powerful alliance that would become the National Rainbow Coalition, NARC. It brought together figures who had once been rivals, bound by a shared goal: end KANU's long rule. The coalition's rise was electric. For the first time in decades, it felt genuinely possible that power could change hands through the ballot. But it was also dangerous. The closer the election came, the more intense the pressure became on politicians to declare where they stood. Neutrality was not an option. If you chose wrong, you could lose everything: your seat, your influence, your protection. If you chose right, you could be part of a new era. Karume, seasoned by decades of political weather, understood the stakes. This was another ticking clock. The final months before the election were the last chance to align with the future before it arrived. He aligned with the opposition wave that was building toward victory. When NARC won in 2002 and Mwai Kibaki became president, Kenya experienced a surge of hope that felt to many like a second independence. The streets celebrated. People spoke of reform, of fighting corruption, of rebuilding institutions. The mood was almost unreal, like the country had been holding its breath for 24 years and finally exhaled. In that new administration, Karume was appointed Minister for Special Programs. It was a portfolio that sounded bureaucratic, almost vague, but in practice it touched the raw nerve of the nation: disaster response, emergency relief and support for vulnerable communities. Droughts, floods, displacement, hunger, these were not abstract policy issues. They were life and death. They were the moments when citizens looked at the state and asked, with anger or desperation, "Do you see us?" For Karume, the appointment was both a peak and a trap. A peak because it placed him inside the machinery of national decision-making at a time when the country expected transformation. A trap because special programs meant crises, and crises mean scrutiny. When food aid is delayed, people don't blame the weather. They blame the minister. When relief supplies are stolen, the public doesn't want explanations. It wants heads to roll. When hunger spreads, every speech sounds like an excuse. And the clock was ticking again, this time not toward an election, but toward the next drought, the next flood, the next headline. In emergency work, you don't get the luxury of slow reform. You either deliver now, or you are judged now. Karume entered government at a moment when expectations were dangerously high. The public wanted miracles. The bureaucracy moved like mud. The political class was already beginning to fracture over promises and positions. The same coalition that had united to win was now struggling to govern as one. And in that tension, Karume had to do what he had always done: operate in the real world, not the ideal one. He was no longer just a businessman politician navigating access. He was now part of the state's face in moments of national pain. When drought hit and families watched livestock collapse into dust. When floods tore through homes, when communities waited for relief, trucks that seemed to take forever, his ministry's actions or failures would be felt directly. This was the new battlefield. Not against colonial officers, not against one-party enforcers, but against the brutal logistics of governance and the unforgiving judgment of a population that had waited too long for dignity. And as he sat in meetings where budgets were debated and priorities fought over, Karume knew something that made the pressure even sharper. Kenya's hope was not infinite. The public's patience had a limit. If the new era failed to deliver, cynicism would return stronger than before. He had seen that cycle in history: dream, disappointment, hardening. He did not have decades to prove himself in this new government. He had months, maybe a few years, before the narrative would set, before people would decide whether 2002 was a turning point or just another change of faces. So he pushed forward in a role defined by urgency, while the political ground under the new administration began to shift again, because the struggle for Kenya's future was never going to be a straight line. And Njenga Karume, who had learned long ago that freedom is only the starting gun, was now running inside the state itself, trying to deliver in a country where time, always time, was the most merciless opponent of all. The first time Njenga Karume walked into a crisis meeting as Minister for Special Programs, the room didn't feel like a cabinet office. It felt like a war room, except the enemy wasn't a rival party or a foreign power. It was a map of Kenya with whole regions shaded like bruises. Drought corridors, floodplains, hunger hotspots, displacement zones. And behind every shaded area, faces, children with dust on their eyelashes, mothers measuring maize flour like medicine, old men staring at empty riverbeds as if the water might be shamed into returning. In politics, you can hide behind speeches. In emergency work, you can't. Hunger doesn't care what coalition you belong to. Karume had spent decades learning how power moves, how to survive shifting regimes, how to build influence that outlasts presidents. But now he was trapped in a job where influence meant nothing if the trucks didn't arrive, where the public didn't judge you by your intentions, but by the weight of a sack of grain. And the clock was always ticking, because drought doesn't wait for procurement procedures. Floods don't pause for committee approvals. A displaced family doesn't have until next quarter to eat. This was the real deadline of his new life. Deliver relief before the headlines turned into funerals. The Ministry for Special Programs was a strange creature in government. Part humanitarian nerve center, part political minefield. It dealt with disaster management and relief food, with vulnerable groups and emergency coordination. It was supposed to be the state's reflex, the part of government that moved fast when everything else moved slow. But Kenya's bureaucracy had been trained for paperwork, not speed. Files could sit, signatures could delay, budgets could be reallocated. And in the middle of it all, Karume had to make decisions that would anger someone no matter what he did. If you send food to one district, another screams that it's being punished. If you prioritize drought, flood victims accuse you of forgetting them. If you tighten controls to prevent theft, local leaders complain you're blocking their supplies. If you loosen controls to move faster, the system leaks, sometimes like a crack, sometimes like a burst pipe. And the most dangerous part was this: relief food is not just food. It is power you can hold in your hands. A bag of maize can become a campaign poster. A truck can become a promise. A distribution list can become a weapon. Karume knew that. He had lived long enough to understand that the ugliest corruption is the kind that wears the mask of charity. So he stepped into a battlefield where the enemy wasn't only nature, it was also the temptation inside the system. People who saw disaster as an opportunity. who treated suffering like a resource to be managed for personal gain. The public had voted in 2002 with a hunger of its own. Hunger for change, for clean government, for a break from the habits of the past. The NARC victory had felt like a second independence, and the expectations were almost impossible. People didn't want gradual improvement. They wanted a moral earthquake. Karume's ministry became one of the places where that moral earthquake would be tested. Because when relief goes missing, citizens don't debate policy, they assume theft. When a hungry region is told to wait, citizens don't ask about logistics, they assume favoritism. And when a minister speaks carefully, citizens don't hear caution, they hear excuses. He was now a man with a reputation to defend in the harshest arena, the arena where the state meets the poor, and he was doing it inside a coalition that was already beginning to crack. NARC had been a marriage of necessity, former rivals united to end KANU's long rule. But once the victory celebrations faded, old ambitions returned like a fever. Promises made during the campaign, especially about constitutional reform and power sharing, became sources of bitterness. The government's internal unity began to fray, and every ministry became a stage where factions watched each other, counted favors, and prepared for the next fight. Karume, older than many of the new stars, had seen this movie before. Coalitions win elections. They don't automatically win peace. He tried to keep his work grounded in delivery. In emergency response, ideology is a luxury. You either coordinate or you fail. You either move supplies or you watch people starve. But coordination in government is never just technical. It is political. To move relief, you need the treasury. You need transport. You need provincial administration. You need local networks. You need security in some areas. You need credible data. You need to know who is truly vulnerable and who is inflating numbers. And every one of those needs runs through human beings. Human beings with loyalties, grudges, and agendas. Karume's strength had always been his ability to operate through networks. He understood the informal Kenya that sits beneath the formal one, the phone calls, the personal relationships, the quiet agreements that make the official machine actually move. In that sense, he was built for this job. But the job was built to break reputations. Because even when you do everything right, disaster still looks like failure. A minister can coordinate perfectly and still face a drought so severe that relief only slows the suffering instead of stopping it. And the public doesn't clap for slowed suffering. The public wants rescue. In those years, Kenya faced recurring drought emergencies that hit pastoralist communities and arid regions with brutal force. Livestock, savings on four legs, died in the open. Families walked long distances for water. Schools emptied as children were pulled out to help search for food or move with herds. The images were stark: cracked earth, empty pans, lines of people waiting for rations under a sun that looked indifferent. Karume's ministry had to respond in a country where the logistics of distance are unforgiving. Some of the hardest-hit areas were remote, with poor roads and limited infrastructure. A truck could take days. A breakdown could mean a week. A delayed payment could mean a contractor refusing to move. A single missing signature could hold up an entire convoy. And every delay had a human cost. This is where the tension in Karume's story sharpened. He had spent his life mastering systems, colonial systems, party systems, business systems. Now he was fighting the most merciless system of all: time. Time measured in empty stomachs. Time measured in dehydration. Time measured in the moment a family decides to leave home because staying has become impossible. He pushed for faster response, for coordination, for the kind of practical action that doesn't make for poetic speeches but keeps people alive. Yet the ministry's work existed under constant suspicion, because Kenya's history had trained citizens to doubt, and sometimes the suspicion was justified. Not necessarily because of Karume personally, but because relief operations are magnets for theft and manipulation. Food aid can be diverted, lists can be altered, supplies can be sold, local power brokers can capture distribution. Even well-designed programs can be undermined by the simple fact that desperate people are easy to exploit. So Karume's conflict wasn't only with drought and floods, it was with the shadow economy that grows around disaster. And then, as if the job wasn't hard enough, the political ground shifted again. The same government that had come in on a wave of unity began to split into camps. The constitutional reform process, so central to the hopes of 2002, became a battlefield. The 2005 constitutional referendum turned into a national showdown. And it didn't just divide voters, it divided the ruling coalition itself. Kenya's politics, always intense, became electric with rivalry. Allies became opponents. Cabinet colleagues became campaign enemies. The air filled with accusations, counter-accusations, and the kind of rhetoric that makes every public servant wonder, if I choose wrong, will I be punished? For Karume, this was familiar territory, politics as survival. But now he was older, and the stakes were different. He wasn't trying to build a name. He was trying to protect a legacy, to remain relevant, to keep his influence from being swept away by a new generation of political warriors. And he had another deadline, quieter but just as real: age. In Kenyan politics, elders can be revered, but they can also be sidelined. The country was changing. The media was louder. Civil society was more aggressive. The public was less patient with old-style politics. The new era demanded not just power, but performance, and performance that could survive scrutiny. Karume's reputation as a successful businessman and political insider could be read in two ways. To supporters, it was proof of competence. A man who knew how to build, how to manage, how to deliver. To critics, it was proof of everything they feared. An elite that had benefited from the system while ordinary people struggled. He had to navigate that double image while the government itself was being judged. After the referendum, the political landscape realigned. New opposition formations emerged. Old alliances collapsed. The road to the 2007 election became a tense march, with the country increasingly polarized. Karume remained a significant figure, but the center of gravity in Kenyan politics was shifting toward a more confrontational style. The stakes of elections were rising, and with them the danger. In 2007, Kenya went to the polls in one of the most consequential elections in its history. The contest was fiercely disputed, and when the results were contested, the country erupted. What followed was a national trauma, post-election violence that tore through communities, leaving deaths, displacement, and fear. Neighbors turned on neighbors, homes burned, people fled with nothing but what they could carry. The images were horrifying: smoke rising from settlements, crowds running, families sleeping in makeshift camps, children staring with the blank shock of those who have seen too much. For a man like Karume, who had lived through the emergency, who had seen what political conflict can do to ordinary lives, this was not just another crisis. It was a nightmare returning in a new form. And it was a brutal reminder of something Kenya had never fully escaped. Politics could still become violence. In that period, the idea of special programs took on a darker meaning. Displacement was no longer only about floods or drought. It was about human beings driven from their homes by other human beings. Relief was no longer only about weather. It was about rebuilding lives after political collapse. The country's institutions were tested. The government's legitimacy was questioned. International mediators stepped in. Kenya stood on a knife edge, and everyone could feel it. One wrong move, one more spark, and the whole nation could slide into something far worse. Karume's role in those years cannot be separated from the broader reality. He was part of the political class that had to face a public asking in raw pain, "How did you let this happen?" Even if you weren't the one lighting the match, you were standing in the house when it burned. The violence and its aftermath forced Kenya into a new political arrangement. A coalition government meant to stop the bleeding. It was a compromise born from crisis, not from trust. And it came with a new urgency: reform the country or risk repeating the disaster. This is where Karume's long experience mattered again. He had seen Kenya under colonial rule, under one-party dominance, under multi-party turbulence, under a reform wave, and now under a coalition forged by trauma. He understood that stability is not a slogan. It is something you build, painfully, with institutions and restraint. But building institutions is slow, and Kenya's public, after 2007-2008, was not in the mood for slow. The push for a new constitution gained momentum, driven by the belief that the old political structure, too centralized, too winner, takes all, had helped create the conditions for conflict. The constitutional process became a national mission, heavy with hope and fear. In 2010, Kenya promulgated a new constitution, one of the most significant political transformations since independence. It introduced devolution, a new Bill of Rights, and reforms aimed at limiting executive power and strengthening institutions. For many Kenyans, it felt like the country was trying to rewrite its own fate. For Karume, it was a moment loaded with irony and weight. He had spent his life navigating systems, first colonial, then post-colonial, often relying on networks and personal influence. Now Kenya was trying, at least on paper, to reduce the power of networks and increase the power of rules. It was the kind of change that can make old power brokers nervous, because when institutions become stronger, the informal shortcuts become weaker. When transparency increases, the shadows shrink. When power is devolved, the old center loses some of its grip. Yet Karume was also a man who had fought for freedom in the first place. The Constitution's promise, more rights, more accountability, more inclusion, was aligned with the dream that had driven the independence. Struggle, even if the path had been messy, this was the tension of his era. The very reforms Kenya needed could also threaten the way politics had been practiced for decades. And still, through all of this, Karume remained what he had always been, a figure at the intersection of politics and enterprise. His business legacy, especially in real estate and hospitality, was part of the story of Nairobi itself. The city had grown from a colonial administrative hub into a sprawling capital, and men like Karume had helped shape its African-owned commercial landscape. Property in Kenya is not just wealth, it is permanence. It is a claim on the future. But permanence can also become a symbol that divides. In a country where land remains an emotional and political wound, wealthy landowners are often viewed with suspicion. The question, "How did you get it?" hangs in the air, even when the answer is legal, and when inequality is visible, when some live behind walls and others live in tin-roofed rooms. Wealth becomes political, whether you want it to or not. Karume's public image carried that complexity. To many, he was an example of African enterprise, a man who rose from humble beginnings, who built businesses, who proved that Kenyans could own and run major ventures. To others, he represented the elite that had benefited disproportionately from independence. And in the new Kenya of louder media and sharper public debate, those arguments were no longer whispered. They were broadcast. Yet Karume's political survival across regimes suggests a deeper truth about him. He understood the art of being useful. Not always popular, not always loved, but useful. In government, usefulness is currency. It buys you protection. It buys you relevance. It buys you a seat at tables where decisions are made. As Kenya moved through reform, coalition politics, and constitutional change, Karume's long career stood as a bridge between eras, between the generation that fought colonial rule and the generation that fought for institutional reform. But bridges are walked on. They are not celebrated. And the pressure of being a bridge is that you are always being tested by weight from both sides. The young demand that you step aside. The old demand that you hold the line. The public demands that you explain the past. The future demands that you adapt. Karume's story in these years is not the story of a man delivering a single dramatic victory. It is the story of endurance inside a country that kept reinventing its crises. Drought, flood, displacement, political fracture, violence, reform. Another election cycle. Another round of promises. Another round of disappointment. And through it all, the same brutal question returned again and again, like a drumbeat. When Kenya is hurting, does the state show up? As Minister for Special Programs, and as a senior political figure, Karume was repeatedly placed in the line of that question. Sometimes the answer was yes. Trucks moved, aid arrived, coordination happened, lives were stabilized. Sometimes the answer was not enough, because not enough is what disaster so often forces on governments, especially in countries where resources are limited and needs are vast. But the public rarely grades on a curve. The public grades on pain, and pain makes people unforgiving. By the time Kenya entered the new constitutional era, Karume had already lived several political lifetimes. He had been shaped by colonial repression, by independence optimism, by one-party consolidation, by multi-party turbulence, by reformist hope, and by post-election trauma. He had learned that history doesn't move in a straight line. It loops, it repeats, it returns with new faces. And now, as the country tried to build a new framework for itself, the question hanging over every veteran of the old system, including Karume, was sharp and unavoidable. In the Kenya that is coming, will there still be a place for the kind of power you mastered? Because the new constitution was not just a document, it was a warning shot. A warning that the era of unchecked central power was supposed to end. A warning that citizens wanted more control over their lives. A warning that the old political games had brought the country too close to the edge. For Karume, who had always understood the importance of timing, the message was clear. The window was closing again. Not the window to seize opportunity, like in the early independence years, but the window to define how history would remember you. And that is a different kind of deadline, one that no amount of money, no network, no office can negotiate with. Because when the country changes its rules, it also changes its memory. And Njenga Karume, still standing after decades of storms, was now facing the most unpredictable force of all. Not a drought, not a rival, not even a regime, but the judgment of a new Kenya deciding what to keep, what to reject, and what to finally, painfully leave behind. The new Kenya was being born on paper. Fresh ink, bold promises, a constitution that sounded like a clean break. But for Njenga Karume, the break wasn't clean at all. It was jagged. Because when a country rewrites its rules, it doesn't just redesign institutions. It drags old lives into the light. And Karume had lived too long, moved too far, accumulated too much, to believe that the light would be gentle. By 2010, he was no longer the young man who had slipped through colonial crackdowns, no longer the hungry entrepreneur counting coins and calculating risk, no longer the rising politician learning how to survive the moods of presidents. He was an elder statesman, wealthy, connected, and permanently associated with the Kenya that had been, the Kenya of backroom influence, of land as destiny, of politics as a contact sport, of survival through networks. Now the country was promising something else: institutions over individuals, transparency over discretion, devolution over the old center. And that promise carried a threat, because in a nation where land is not just property but memory, where every acre can carry a story of displacement, privilege, or struggle, any man known for real estate becomes a symbol whether he wants to be or not. Karume's name, for many, had become shorthand for a certain kind of success. The kind that looked like proof of African enterprise to some and like proof of elite capture to others. The Constitution didn't accuse him, it didn't name him, but it changed the atmosphere around him. It made questions louder. How did wealth meet power? How did power meet land? And who paid the price? Karume had spent decades mastering the art of being useful to the state, but the new era was asking whether the state had been useful to the people. That shift, subtle on paper, brutal in public debate, was the kind of shift that could turn a respected elder into a target. And there was another clock ticking now, one he could not outmaneuver with alliances or strategy. His health. Age is a quiet deadline. It doesn't announce itself with sirens. It arrives like a slow tightening, a shorter breath, a longer recovery, a day when the body refuses to do what the mind still believes it can command. Karume had always been a man of motion. Political motion, business motion, the constant movement of someone who learned early that standing still in Kenya could be dangerous. But in his early 80s, the motion began to change. The pace slowed. The public appearances became less frequent. The center of gravity shifted from building the next thing to protecting what had already been built. And protecting a legacy is harder than building one. Because building is private. You can do it behind walls, behind contracts, behind quiet deals. Legacy is public. It belongs to other people's mouths. It belongs to headlines, to rumors, to the way strangers tell your story when you're not in the room to correct them. In those final years, Karume remained a figure of weight. His name still carried the authority of the independence generation, the aura of a man who had been present at the creation of modern Kenya and had managed, unlike many, to turn that presence into lasting wealth. He was associated with major business interests, especially in property and hospitality, sectors that had helped shape Nairobi's skyline and Kenya's urban economy. But the country around him was changing its heroes. A younger Kenya was growing up with different instincts. It was less impressed by proximity to power and more suspicious of it. It was more willing to ask uncomfortable questions about the independence generation. Not only what they fought for, but what they built afterward, and who got locked out of the benefits. And then came the twist that makes history feel cruel. The constitution that promised a new beginning also created a new kind of political battlefield. Devolution meant new local power centers, new rivalries, new competitions for resources. The old national chessboard was being replaced by dozens of smaller boards, each with its own kings, its own pawns, its own fights. For veterans like Karume, this was disorienting. Influence that once flowed through the center now had to negotiate with counties, governors, assemblies, and a public newly empowered, to demand accountability closer to home. The old shortcuts didn't disappear overnight, but they became riskier. The shadows were thinner, and in thinner shadows, even a small scandal can look enormous. Karume's life had always been lived near the edge of controversy. Not necessarily because of proven wrongdoing, but because in Kenya, wealth and politics are rarely separated cleanly enough to satisfy public curiosity. He had been admired and criticized in equal measure. He had been called a patriot and an opportunist, a builder and a beneficiary, a freedom fighter and a symbol of the elite. The truth, as always, was more complicated than the slogans. He had been a man who understood the country as it was, not as it wished to be. He had learned to operate in systems that rewarded proximity, loyalty, and timing. He had also, undeniably, helped expand African participation in business at a time when the commanding heights of the economy were still dominated by colonial-era structures and foreign capital. For many Kenyans, seeing Africans own hotels, own prime property, own major enterprises, this mattered. It was psychological independence made concrete. But psychological independence does not erase inequality. And inequality in the new Kenya was becoming the loudest accusation of all. As the 2013 election approached, the first under the new constitution, Kenya's political temperature rose again. The memory of 2007-2008 still sat in the nation's throat like smoke that never fully cleared. Every rally, every speech, every rumor carried an undertone of fear. Not fear of losing, but fear of what losing might trigger. Karume by then was not at the center of the new contest the way younger politicians were, but his era was being judged in the background of every debate. The independence generation was being weighed like evidence. Had they delivered the promise? Had they betrayed it? Had they done both? In private circles, among those who had known him for decades, Karume was still seen as a man of sharp instincts. Someone who could read a room, sense a shift, anticipate danger. But even the sharpest instincts cannot negotiate with a failing body. The final opponent is always the same, and it always wins. In early 2012, the news began to harden into certainty. Njenga Karume was seriously ill. The details of illness are often kept close in public life, especially for men of his generation, where vulnerability could be mistaken for weakness. But the signs were there: reduced visibility, the quiet tightening of his circle, the sense that the story was moving toward its last page. And then, on 24 February 2012, the page turned. Njenga Karume died at the age of 82. Death has a way of rearranging a life instantly. The arguments don't stop, but they change shape. Rivals soften their language. Allies become more poetic. The media compresses decades into a few paragraphs. The complexity gets folded into a single question. What did he mean? In Kenya, the death of a figure like Karume is never just a family event. It becomes a national mirror. People look at the man and see the country. They saw a former freedom fighter, one of those who had risked something real when the cost of resistance could be prison, torture, or worse. They saw a politician who had navigated multiple eras, surviving the shifts that swallowed others. They saw a businessman who had built an empire in a country where capital was never just capital, but also access, protection, and leverage. And they saw, in the same silhouette, the contradictions of post-independence Kenya, the dream of liberation alongside the reality of inequality, the promise of nationhood alongside the persistence of patronage, the pride of African enterprise alongside the bitterness of those who felt the system had been captured. His funeral and the reactions around it carried that duality. Tributes spoke of his role in the struggle, his service in government, his contribution to economic development. The language of respect flowed easily, because in Kenya, elders of the independence generation are still treated with a certain reverence, even by those who criticize them. But outside the official tributes, the public conversation did what it always does. It argued. Some remembered him as a man who opened doors, proof that a Kenyan from humble beginnings could rise, could own, could build. Others remembered him as part of a political class that had grown rich while too many remained poor. Some saw his wealth as inspiration, others saw it as indictment. And here was the most unexpected twist of all. In death, Karume became even more symbolic than he had been in life, because his story contained nearly every major theme of Kenya's modern history: colonial repression and the courage to resist it, independence and the scramble to define who would benefit, the rise of African capital and the entanglement of business with politics, the long dominance of powerful parties and the survival tactics required to remain relevant, the reform waves, the coalition fractures, the national traumas, the constitutional rebirth. Karume had not merely lived through these chapters, he had participated in them. He had profited from some. He had been shaped by others. He had, in his own way, helped write them. And that is why his legacy cannot be reduced to a single moral. If you want a clean hero, his story will frustrate you. If you want a clean villain, his story will also frustrate you. Because he was something more common and more unsettling. A real political human being in a real African state, navigating a landscape where ideals and survival are constantly negotiating with each other. After his death, the businesses and properties associated with his name remained part of Kenya's economic fabric. Buildings do not mourn. Land does not apologize. Hotels continue to host weddings and conferences, laughter and deals, while the man who helped build the empire becomes a photograph. On a wall, a name in a story. And yet, even that is a kind of immortality. In Nairobi, where the city's growth has always been a visible argument about who belongs and who benefits, the physical traces of men like Karume become part of the urban memory. You can drive past places shaped by his era and feel the weight of a generation that believed ownership was the final proof of freedom. But the new Kenya, especially after 2010, was beginning to ask a different question. Not only who owns, but who is accountable? That question is the one Karume did not live long enough to fully face in the new constitutional order. He died before the first election under the new system. He died before devolution could fully reveal its promise and its problems. He died before the country could decide whether the constitution would truly change the habits of power or simply rearrange them. In a way, that timing protected him, because the harshest judgments often come not at the end of a life, but in the years after, when a country's values shift and the past is reinterpreted through a new moral lens. Still, the deadline he could not escape, death, did not end the conflict at the heart of his story. It only handed it to the public. Was Njenga Karume a symbol of what Kenya achieved, or of what it failed to fix? The answer depends on where you stand in the country he helped shape. If you stand in the memory of the emergency, when resisting colonial rule could destroy your life, then his participation in the struggle matters deeply. It means he was there when courage was not a performance, but a risk. If you stand in the crowded neighborhoods where opportunity still feels rationed, then his wealth can look like proof that the system has always had winners, and that the winners often sit close to power. If you stand in the business community, his rise can look like a blueprint. Invest, build, diversify, secure assets, think long-term. A Kenyan can create permanence. If you stand in the reformist tradition, his era can look like a cautionary tale. When politics and business intertwine too tightly, the public interest can become negotiable, and perhaps the most honest way to hold his story is to accept that it contains all of these truths at once, because Kenya itself contains them. In the end, the most cinematic image of Njenga Karume is not a single photograph, not a single rally, not a single handshake with a president. It is the image of a man walking through multiple Kenyas: colonial Kenya, independence Kenya, one-party Kenya, multi-party Kenya, reform Kenya, always adjusting his stride, always reading the wind, always trying to stay standing. And then, finally, the wind stops for everyone. What remains is the country, a country still wrestling with the same forces that shaped him: land, power, inequality, ambition, survival, hope. And somewhere inside that wrestling is the reason his story still matters. Because Njenga Karume is not only a biography, he is a question Kenya keeps asking itself. What did we do with our freedom? And who did it truly set free?